Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, today I want to talk to you about running and or exercising on Shabbat or Yom Tov. And my friends, the reason this video is so important is that I have many runners who contact me wondering if and how they can practice their sport and run and even run a marathon on Shabbat if they wanted to. And friends, if you find yourself in this group, I think that I can help you today. First, we will mention the possible issues with running on Shabbat or exercising, and then explain them one by one to really understand the issue. So first, you have to understand that running is not one of the 39 melachot prohibited on Shabbat. If you search them, running will not be there. However, that does not literally mean that running would be allowed. And friends, I know many from the outset would just say that running, of course not, it can't be allowed. Why? On the basis that nobody does it on Shabbat. So how can it be allowed? And friends, that is the wrong answer. But regardless, friends, today we're going to explore this issue in depth to really know what's going on. So, like we said, running is not one of the 39 melachot. Actually, the whole halacha derives from a pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu, which tells us that this is a rabbinic prohibition, a din derabanan and not medoraita, which is always the first thing we should ask when trying to understand any halacha. And it is also important to know that most of the prophets themselves were also members of the court, and their words or statements would only really carry rabbinic weight and not Torah weight. And the reason I mention this is that many today do not make a distinction between Nach and Torah. But anyways, it reads, Im tashiv mishabat raglecha, if you turn away your foot because of the Sabbath, hafasecha beyom kadshi, from pursuing your own business on my holy day, vekarata leShabbat oneg, and call the Sabbath a delight, ligdosh Adonai mechubad, and the holy of the Lord honorable, vichibarto measot derarecha, and you honor it, not doing your own ways, memesot havsecha vedaber davar, nor pursuing your business, nor speaking of it. And from the outset, it seems pretty clear enough. It seems to be regarding business and slightly referencing chol, weekday activity. But in this, it is not so explicit. And this is how the Kolbo and many other commentators and codifiers understand it, that it's only from a halachic level regarding business. But you will see how many will try to build a lot on this notion. So we will begin seeing how Chazal actually understood the pasuk. And the first portion that this is mentioned by Chazal is in Masechet Shabbat, where the discussion of possibly taking long strides on Shabbat might be forbidden under the verse we just discussed in Sefer Yeshayahu. They actually give the opinion that it might be forbidden based on the assumption that it is unhealthy to run or really take long strides in general. I mean, literally they said, שאני אומר פסיע גסה נוטלת אחד מ500 ממאור עיניו של אדם ומהדר לי בקדושה דבי שמשי. Long strides take away a 500th part of a man's eyesight and is restored to him by the evening kiddush. And then, my friends, it goes on to say that it's even forbidden on weekdays because it causes illnesses. Now we know that this, from a health perspective, is not true. And we also know that the later Rishonim did not consider this portion here to be halachic, at least regarding the possibility of it being a health issue. Mainly because there was no Mishnaic source that stated that running or taking long strides was forbidden, and especially because of health. Remember, all this at the end must come together, and this is how halacha is actually formulated. Nowadays, someone will just pick up a Mishneh Torah or Shulchan Aruch and take what's written there and assume that this is a law. Now, there's really nothing entirely wrong with this, but sometimes if you really want to understand the law, you have to compare the later Rishonim with the actual Mishnah to really get a full picture. But regardless, this Gemara does not really give us closure on this issue, and it's more advice than halakha. Bad advice if you ask me. Anyways, the next Gemara is in Brachot 6b. And here the Gemara starts off where the last one left off. It states, Amar Rabbi Chalbo, Amar Rav Huna, Rabbi Chalbo in the name of Rav Huna says, Hayotze mi beit haKnesset, when a man leaves the synagogue, al hafseya pisya gasa, he should not take large steps. Amar Abaye, Abaye says, Lo amaran el lemepak, that this is only when he goes from the synagogue. Aval lemeal mitzvah lemirhat, but when one goes to the synagogue, it is a pious deed to run. So here Chazal is stating that there is nothing asur with running on Shabbat. And this is not only allowed, but it is praiseworthy when doing so for a mitzvah, like it mentioned, running to a synagogue. So the Gemara here is really, it's making it hard for us to understand the actual problem with running, if there is any. So the next source is from the Tosefta in Shabbat, which states that one cannot run on Shabbat in order to sweat. It uses the word lahithamel. Now, some do translate this word as exercise. But regardless, this Tosefta is a bit obscure. Actually, we can assume that this is where the Rambam picked up his notion on sweating and other ideas mentioned by Chazal, which also may have led him to mention that exerting oneself on Shabbat may also be asur. However, we also see that the Rambam also explains what's written in Sefer Yeshayahu literally by stating the words running and jumping as possible issues. And this he classifies as uvda dechol or uvdin dechol, as a weekday activity. But we then see in the next halacha of the same parak that the Rambam states that it is allowed to run on Shabbat if it's a mitzvah, teaching us that he, apart from mentioning the initial prohibition, is now telling us that it was only prohibited if it caused you to actually break Shabbat, as the verse stated, by doing business on Shabbat. Actually, if you look at the beginning of the halacha and all the surrounding halachot in the chapter of that chapter of Hilchot Shabbat, of the Mishnah Torah, it's all regarding doing business and not literally running on Shabbat. But friends, the fact remains that the same Rambam did not bring down running in itself as a form of breaking Shabbat. And in the portion where he mentions sweating, it is only mentioned when it is used as a form of refuah, when it's used for medicinal purposes, which is asur on Shabbat, which is prohibited. Which is actually how Rav Kapach, who was the leading authority on understanding the Mishnah Torah, understood it to mean. So friends, so far it looks like you might be able to run on Shabbat after all. So let's recap the reasons why running or exercising on Shabbat might be asur or mutad or permissible on Shabbat. Number one, some say that it would be asur for Kodesh reasons, because it's not in the spirit of Shabbat, or how they say it today, Shabbistic. Now, this is certainly a real concern, the issue of uvda dechol, of weekday or mundane activity. It is a real halakhic issue, my friends. However, the problem is that these activities, at least from a Mishnaic level, are never classified from a halakhic perspective. Because honestly, who's to decide what is an oneg Shabbat? I mean, no one but you. Each person could. In other words, like we said, Chazal prohibited engaging in certain otherwise permissible activities on Shabbat on the grounds that they were labeled weekday activities. However, the exact parameters of uvda dechol or uvdin dechol, weekday activities, are never clearly delineated by Chazal. So it's not possible for us today to label anything as uvda dechol outside of the handful of things mentioned, by which running was never one of them included. Anyways, the next is prohibiting it for business reasons, which everyone agrees is what the pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu was saying in the first place. Actually, the reference to running that could also be derived slightly from the pasuk is actually running to do business, and clearly not running for exercise or because you enjoy running. And the last area that we will cover is an area that is also covered in the same pasuk, and that's when it reminds us to delight on Shabbat. Like we said, oneg Shabbat, doing something that is delightful for you on the Sabbath as a way of sanctifying the Sabbath. And friends, this area, like the area or the notion of something being Shabbistic, is something really that is subjective in nature. In other words, no one can tell you what not to do on Shabbat if you're not deliberately breaking a law on Shabbat just because they don't like it, which is actually what is done today. All right, but anyways, I will bring down some sources that explains my point a little clearer. So we have in Sefer Mitzvot HaKatan, also known as a Smak, it states that on that same pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu, that it holds that it would be perfectly permissible for bachrim, for young men, to run on Shabbat if they enjoyed and acquired no profit from doing it. Which again was the prohibition mentioned in Sefer Yeshayahu, which was business. And he is really the first to tie it all together properly, in my opinion. I mean, everything we just explained. That one should run on Shabbat when doing a mitzvah, and that bachrim can run if they enjoy it, as long as you're not doing business, under the concept of oneg Shabbat. Actually, the Torah quotes the same statement by the Smach of young men running on Shabbat, and he even states that they can even run to see something that interests them. So it's not just running for fun, but even running to see something interesting, again, under the notion of oneg. And there are commentators like the Shla that even allow secular learning in Shabbat, like reading newspapers, again, under the idea of delighting in the Sabbath. So, non-Kodesh things are allowed as long as they are not prohibited. And friends, even the Shulchan Aruch, what the majority of Jews claim to hold by nowadays, follows the opinion of the Torah on stating that running a Shabbat could also be done for enjoyment, or even to run to go see something interesting. And the Magen Avraham and the Mishnah Berurah state the same notion of running not prohibited under the notion of Oneg Shabbat. And friends, this is one reason not to get too hooked on understanding halakha through one Rishon, whether it's the Mishnah Torah, the Shulchan Aruch, and not be afraid to delve back into the Mishnah, or in this case, even Tanakh, to get a full understanding of the halakha. Now, don't get me wrong, people can't just build halakha on any source they want. So you can't build it on sources like the Zohar or Tanya. Why? Because the understanding on how halakha is formulated is in Torah Shebiktav, which is pretty clear, and that's that anyone who ultimately paskins outside of Chazal is a heretic. And yes, even some of the Nevi'im fall under Chazal. So what's the final outcome? Well, it's that you can run and exercise in Shabbat, although you shouldn't do it, at least according to the Rambam, if it's being done for medicinal purposes. And even in this area, there are other opinions. Now, if you're carrying anything when running, you must be running within an Eruv. And if you must carry something outside of an Eruv, there are ways to make things that you're carrying as if you're not carrying them. But this is another video in itself. And friends, I want you all to remember a fundamental principle when applying and understanding halakha that is almost non-existent nowadays. And that's the principle of Safek D'Rabbanan Lechakel or Lekula, and Safek D'Oraita Lechumra, that when you have a question on an issue that is rabbinic, one is commanded to always take a more lenient opinion. And when you have a question on a Torah issue, one is commanded to take the more strict opinion. And this is not an opinion, this is the halakha. And the issue we're dealing with today was a question on a rabbinic issue. My friends, for more information on anything Jewish, please visit doordea.com. Thank you.